It was the free artisans that generated creativity and dared to experiment with other methods that eventually would become part of what is today traditional French construction. This antagonism turned especially bloody during the Reformation because many of the immigrant artisans were Protestant, and members of the corporation used this as a pretext to vent their deep sentiment toward them. Those who were not able to leave Paris were assaulted and others were killed during the massacre on the Rue de Charonne. It also underscores how furniture making was never an impassive profession. In France, a profession extremely sensitive to political turmoil and inextricably tied to societal and religious movement. If you look at a current map of Paris, the Faubourg resembles a prominent vein of highly figured plank. It is a historic artery that spans from the Bastille to Nation and forever intertwines the history of furniture making with that of its social history, and would blister into the first French Revolution, 1783. The Faubourg today does not fully resemble its past. Up until perhaps 40 years ago, every shop along its wide street was affiliated in one way or another to the furniture making profession. Sadly, only a few shops from that period remain today. There were no restaurants or clothing stores or tasteless furniture stores of today. Instead, there was an endless stream of artisan shops known as boutiques and ateliers that offered a specialty. Without exaggeration, a log could enter the Faubourg from one end and emerge as a finished piece of wood furniture, masterpiece at the other, hardware and all. The Faubourg Saint-Antoine goes well beyond its wide street, but encompasses as well a maze of tentacles that branches in all directions. Tiny streets, alleyways that filter throughout the convergence into the Faubourg through important tributaries such as the Rue de Montreuil, the Feder, Coligny, Ledru-Rollin, Charonne, Rouly, just to name a few. Names that are in every history book that refer to the first French revolt. However, the Rue de Montreuil was well known to that as before, especially during the 17th century, in the swashbuckling epic of the King's Musketeers. At 37B Rue de Montreuil, I found an expert gilder. Gilding was the only training not offered at the École Boulle, where I spent most of my nights and weekends practicing the lengthy phases of proper gilding, not how it's taught here in the States, proper gilding as it's been in France since about 300 to 400 years ago. I happily discovered that within this unevenly paved cobblestones and partly decrepit courtyard once stood the horse stables of D'Artagnan, the fourth musketeer. There still remain structural elements in this cavernous courtyard that have been attributed to the 16th century. In fact, there are seemingly hundreds of these courtyards along the Faubourg and in the adjacent streets, hidden like secret sanctuaries. Not all of them are accessible, and many still house businesses that can be traced back to the other centuries. The Rue de Montreuil was also important for housing the first great manufacturing of wallpaper, Revillon, who unfortunately succumbed to the sacking and burning of the First Revolution. It was a source of irony to me as I contemplated the delicate and painstaking art of gilding against the events that shaped and reshaped France from the 1700s up until the latter part of the 19th century on the Rue de Faubourg. That a community of artisans who practiced professions that produced such astonishing beauty and expertise could also be the center of so much violent upheaval. Often, when I left the tiny gilder's atelier at 10 o'clock at night, unlit, huddled against my coat, braving against a nasty wind at times through the winter, I swore I could hear the sounds of hooves against the cobbled stones and imagined what is known to be through diaries that Benjamin Franklin's carriage racing to yet another courtyard in the Faubourg after a day of trying to convince the French to fund our revolution. I have no doubt that Franklin would spend as much time as he possibly could to observe and discover what methods were being used to produce such superlative works of art. Franklin was very much a part of the years of enlightenment in France and was highly esteemed by the French, perhaps more so than he was at the time in the colonies. And his unquenchable thirst for knowledge on all fronts confronted me in my own quest along the faubourg. There is another element that is essential to these venerated traditions, and that it is indispensable contribution of talented immigrants. France, especially Paris, was and continues to be the real melting pot of the world today. The original melting pot, which artisans brought their techniques that ensured a constant supply of innovation in the world and history of art, a kind of regular transfusion, overlapping and merging into what became the center of creativity and construction and design in the late 17th and 18th centuries, spawned new industries in France that nourished its voracious appetite for developing the finest products in the world. The Rue de Faubourg Saint-Ouen, which surrounds the École Bulle, and where I spent most of my nights and weekends after class, was once the culminating point of much of the history, as well as the provoking of the first French Revolution. This long and famous street, with its cavernous courtyards, held within its midst some of the great names in wood, venerated masters that are still discussed and studied highly today by those who are in art history. I had the good fortune to meet some of these remaining artisans who meticulously nurture this love and respect of wood. And it is this same love of wood that carved out my own personal history and drew me into the birthplace of furniture making. I'm a self-taught furniture maker who sought what I could for inspiration and training throughout the states and the colonies, and spending much time at Winterthur in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the PMA, delving into art books and even videos to a lesser extent in the early 90s. I was constantly frustrated by the absence of a reputable institution or even an accredited internship in the United States, which does not exist. The few encounters I did have with those so-called master craftsmen ended in deception and misrepresentation, and this still exists today in the United States. Even with the restorers today, much misrepresentation. It wasn't until I traveled to France I encountered authentic master craftsmen, artisans who were the last guardians of the true beaux arts in the world. Unexpectedly, I also experienced for the first time in my career generous artisans. Here in the States, they're not so giving of information. It's more of a competition. But in France, it was giving with an impassioned desire to share information. Magnanimous human beings that happened to be exceptionally talented and dedicated to their profession, bridging personalities. I was able to share a camaraderie with these artisans that was unlike any I ever had in the last 25 years of my profession in the States. Although the École Bulle thrust me into the historical context and overwhelmed me with information, my true metamorphosis occurred with those compatriots of the Faubourg. They offer me practice and one-on-one explanations using gestures or books when I could not understand the translation of French, and what became another kind of language, the language of wood, the language of hand movement. These dear individuals invited me into their homes to share sumptuous meals, graced by the passion of wood, furniture making, history of their families, accentuated by the robust wines of France. And whether I gesticulated or spoke in broken French, I was understood. Often I was told that my willingness to endeavor on such a journey so far away from the American shore demonstrated to them a true passion for my dedication to wood, restoration, conservation, and the decorative arts in general. It is with reciprocal respect that I happily share with you some of my reasons why French classical construction has never had any competition and why their prideful savoir-faire, which is considered the know-how to conserve their patrimony, is so rich and fascinating. I thank you for your attention and for giving me the opportunity to speak about my discoveries and experiences in France. I fully intend to continue my long quest along the Faubourg to the end of my life, and to further my knowledge of what I feel is a necessary profession, preserving the past, whether it is in Americana or French high style. It is a way to make history tangible and alive, and especially important to me, to keep the voices of so many talented, gifted artists audible for future generations to learn from. In the West, if the Western culture was unaware of the consequence of raising the forest, the least we can do is honor these former trees and logs by preserving them in different forms with the best of our abilities.